Final Fantasy XIV is easy. It is all memorization. Whenever I bring up the topic of either the complexity or difficulty or something close to of Final Fantasy XIV, this kind of statement almost always comes up in some shape or another. It is sometimes accompanied by difficulty isn't subjective, but that's a separate matter. Now, you might think that I'm about to suggest it isn't all memorization, but actually, I had a good long thought about this, and indeed, it kind of is all memorization. But if you want to disparage Final Fantasy XIV in particular with this discovery, then there is a small problem with that, as that good long thought went a lot deeper than just that. So let's talk about memorization. The idea that is often put forth when people say that this game is all memorization is the fact that every boss fight in the game follows either a completely predictable sequence or has a very limited amount of random paths that it can take. Of course, who gets targeted by what can be a little less predictable at times, but at the heart of it all, every boss fight plays out in a fully predictable way, and those random elements are typically also predictable enough that each individual can optimize how they respond to every random possibility. However, even that can be considered a deeper level of memorization. Additionally, it is all memorization, of course, also implies that the actions of your character, so your job, is also entirely down to memorization, which is also true, universally in a way. In the same way that you might learn Valiamanda Extreme as the first half, which includes the whole fire phase, and then learn the Ice and Thunder phase as they come up in a random order, a job with a semi-random rotation is kind of that same idea. The Dancer rotation is a fully memorized sequence that just happens to sometimes have a little sidetrack with feathers and different filler GCDs, and every so often has a sequence of possible outcomes when using the dances. We can make this same observation for any other job with some random elements in it. It is still kind of all memorization, just in more pieces to memorize. What this can often come down to is the fact that as bosses, or enemies in general in the PvE environment of Final Fantasy XIV, don't have very much randomness in them, and whatever randomness they do have is fully predictable too, which then as a knock-on effect means that what you do with your fully memorizable job also becomes fully predictable. With enough attention, time and focus put into it, you would probably be able to tell me exactly what action you use 6 minutes and 37 seconds into a given fight. As with enough experience, the answer will typically be the same, regardless of any random elements in the particular fight. Where this argument, that specifically because it is all memorization it becomes trivial, sort of falls apart, is when we start to realize that when I say it is all memorization, I take it to a bit more of an extreme. If we take a small step over to Final Fantasy XIV's PvP scene, some things change, but other things stay the same. Your opponent is now able to act in a different sequence every time. In fact, they could act in a deliberately stupid way to be less predictable. However, that doesn't change the fact that, that's right, it is still all memorization. Memorize the optimal sequences of abilities you can or should do. Memorize any unusual sequences that could trip up your opponent. Memorize what your opponents can do to counter you, which targets to focus, which ones to avoid. In fact, memorizing what your opponent can do also means that it is kind of irrelevant that they can deliberately act stupidly to be less predictable. What they're actually doing is choosing to play worse, and if you know that, well then you just win. Since you memorized and executed on that memory better than they did. See, that is a slightly important nuance here that is often ignored when someone says, it's all memorization, because you might know exactly what the correct answer is because you memorized it, but simply can't execute on it well enough. For instance, try memorizing an optimal opener and rotation for one of the stricter jobs like Samurai and Machinist. Just memorize it, don't practice it, just memorize it. Do it for one you don't normally play, and then see if you can execute it perfectly first try. Some players might be able to do that, but many simply can't. Now, some of you might dig your heels in on the suggestion of PvP is all memorization. Sure, just like with PvE, there is also the execution part. You might give the suggestion that your opponent might just change their strategy to counter yours, and how do you memorize that? You memorize the tells of whatever strategy they are going to use. In a strategy game like StarCraft 2, a tactic that may sometimes be used is to start doing something that implies one strategy, so that when your opponent sends a scout to check what you're doing, so they can counter it, they get one answer, and once they're no longer looking, you change to the strategy you were actually going to do. Like a fencing match of wits. Possibly one of the ultimate examples of it is all memorization in a PvP game might very well be chess. One thing is of course understanding and knowing various effective strategies, but that's memorization. But another is to know what the most effective move is for a given board state, also memorization. In a way, this same observation can be made for more active PvP games, although board states, quote-unquote, become more abstract in those cases. Granted, you probably just won't memorize every possible board state, especially not the less common or less likely ones, but with experience, you get better acquainted with specific board states, learn what moves tend to lead to more advantageous board states, which ones don't. But that is also all memorization. Or what? You could have memorized exactly what needs to happen to achieve victory, whether it is in a Final Fantasy XIV boss fight, a PvP match, a chess match, or honestly anything else for that matter. But if you can't execute it right, then that doesn't matter. This is also why it takes a bit more than just reading or watching a job guide to be able to perfectly copy what you just learned. Repetition to both better internalize that memory, but also to practice the execution of it. We also say that while watching a guide for a boss fight can much better prepare you for it, to know what needs to happen, nothing ever quite can replace actual practice with the fight itself. Which is also why some mechanics that are particularly complex have had entire simulators made just to practice them. Knowing something, understanding something, memorizing something is not the same as being able to do something. Although it would be wildly convenient if that were the case. Now, sometimes it may feel like that is actually all that is required. For example, if you already have plenty of experience with a specific thing, you very well might be able to memorize something and then execute it right then. But a better way to explain how that is possible is that you already have the experience to do that something. It just so happens to originate from other things. We just kinda tend to forget that when that happens. In a way, our experience with specific things also impacts our ability to memorize them more efficiently. Although, of course, there are specific tricks to, if I may be so bold, memorize how to memorize better. Or to be more accurate, understand and master how to memorize. Just like how we can understand and master so many other subjects. What I'm getting at is that your ability to memorize and remember something, even in the short term, can be impacted by numerous different things, including, but not limited to, how much you care about that thing in the first place. For instance, I know by heart that this is an integration symbol, but I'm also a mathematician with a master's degree in that. Yet I'm here talking about something completely different, ain't that weird? Meanwhile, it is perfectly possible the average person would simply see this symbol as complicated math stuff, even if they were actually taught about it back in high school. I don't know if that is actually normal. And if I asked you to memorize this symbol now if you didn't before, you would probably memorize it as that thing Kai asked you to memorize, and the likelihood you would remember, if you aren't super into math in the first place, probably would be heavily correlated with how invested you are in showing me up. Which I feel finally leads us back to the initial statement. Final Fantasy XIV is easy, it is all memorization. This statement becomes a lot harder to defend when we recognize that memorization itself isn't trivial or easy inherently, and the difficulty of memorizing something is often heavily correlated with your general experience, understanding, knowledge, and interest in a particular topic. If it was easy to memorize stuff, surely it wouldn't require you to actually pay that much attention in school for the information to not go in one ear and out the other. Well, that is perhaps a bit of an extreme example, but I hope it gets the idea across. The suggestion that the game is easy because it is all memorization also becomes a bit harder to defend or justify when we recognize that there's also the angle of execution involved. Just because you know how to do a thing doesn't mean you just can or will. Which is to say, if Final Fantasy XIV was easy because it is all memorization, then if that was all it took, then most things in life should be easy. But arguably, the execution part is where the difficulty really shines through for most people. Sure, one part is that some people memorize things worse than others. For instance, I know the name and effect of most job actions with a surprising degree of accuracy, but I know a lot of players memorize an action like, say, this one as the 3-sticker thing, or the big one, or just the icon, or the animation, or specifically the keybind they use to use the thing. Some might not even really remember what the move does in detail, but simply memorize that it is good to use relative to certain other options. It is of course called Midare Setsugeka. And this kind of variety in memory also highlights how people might approach memorizing a rotation or a fight differently. Some memorize more details, some less. Some memorize the exact sequence, some memorize the general idea. Some memorize each of the things that require a very specific answer and then leave the rest up to muscle memory and think on the fly. But with that said, once again, execution is where the difficulty usually comes from. If it isn't from the combination of executing on something while simultaneously keeping track of the memory of it. And this is also where that completely separate statement comes back. Difficulty isn't subjective. We're all unique individuals with different interests and different skills. As I've discussed in a previous video on this topic, if we put two similar tasks forward, we can often agree on what task is easier and what task is harder. However, if we try to compare two vastly different tasks, or just try to determine the difficulty of one standalone task, we may have problems. For a really random example, for a blacksmith, like an actual real-life one, that rarely ever uses a computer, just for the sake of this example, booting up Final Fantasy XIV and completing a single dungeon would probably be a much harder task than, I don't know, smithing a sword? On the other hand, even if I have read about it and seen videos about it, I don't even know where I would start to smith a sword, so I would probably rank that as harder than almost any task imaginable in Final Fantasy XIV. Another, perhaps closer to home example is how, every so often, I meet players that say something to the effect of, everyone says this job, this duty, this mechanic is super hard, but I found it super easy. In a way, difficulty is subjective at its finest. Obviously, the slightly less sexy and less concise but more precise version of that statement is difficulty is partly subjective. As just like I can tape together an extreme where my opinion is very obvious, you could too for yours. We could probably put most duties and most jobs in Final Fantasy XIV on a difficulty scale and at least somewhat agree on it, but if we ask just one person to fill it in, whatever preferences they have will heavily cover the way they weigh things. For instance, someone who has never played video games might just scale everything as a 10 out of 10 on the difficulty scale, as they have no point of reference. Even if asked to compare something like Sastasha to an ultimate, they might have difficulty reasonably placing the difficulties, as for them, Sastasha might already appear like a 7 out of 10, hypothetically anyway. On the other hand, someone who has completed every ultimate and might even join random party finder groups for ultimate just for the fun of it would probably grade the difficulty of everything a lot lower. Which kind of leads us back to the memorization angle that we started with. Regardless of whatever objective difficulty we might give a job, a duty, a task, an individual player is likely to subjectively lean that difficulty further up or down, proportional to how much experience they have internalized with that specific thing. Someone who mains ninja will probably find the job way easier than someone who plays it once in a blue moon, if even that. Someone who has cleared a specific savage boss or ultimate dozens of times is probably going to rank that specific fight as way easier than someone who has never done it, or is actively progging it. We also kind of see this while progging a difficult fight. The parts of the fight you have seen more, the earlier parts, get easier and easier as you practice them more. Muscle memory becomes better for this part, execution becomes easier. The later parts of the fight take more time to be internalized in this way, both because out of the possibly hundreds of pulls, while you saw phase 1 every time, you may only have seen this later bit a handful of times. At the same time, if you then go on to beat this boss over and over week after week, eventually you will have committed the whole fight to memory well enough that it is, probably, actually not that hard. In some cases, some individuals completely forget how much effort it took to get to this point, and so have trouble understanding why others would find this difficult at all, considering how easy it is. Now, for you. I would like to end on a slightly different angle on the difficulty discussion topic. There are some people that will intentionally undersell the difficulty of a task to make it seem easier to overcome, and this works for some and can seem even more overwhelming to others. For some people, being told that a task is easy to do motivates them to push through. It's easy! I should have no problem with this! I'm probably almost there! While other people might instead see it as a problem. I can't do this task, even though it is supposed to be easy. I guess I'm just not good enough. I give up. Similarly, some people might oversell the difficulty of a task to make someone feel less bad about having trouble with it. However, this perfectly highlights how different we all are as people, as I could make the exact same argument to make it a problem to call a task hard to do. For some, it can be motivating. I'm having trouble getting this right, but it is hard, so I'll keep pushing until I get it. While others use it as an excuse. I can't do it. It is too hard. I'll never get it. I give up. Although, with both of those coins examined, I do still feel that calling a duty easy once you have beaten it takes away the credit you deserved for beating it. You could just say it was challenging to overcome, even if, subjectively, it isn't hard anymore. But what do you think? Do you have a story, or an example perhaps, of something where even though it felt like all you had to do was memorize, it was a lot harder than it seemed? Or maybe you have a story about how a really difficult task suddenly became a lot easier to you as you got more experience with it. I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, it isn't uncommon for MMORPGs like Final Fantasy XIV to have options, usually third-party, to produce boss fight timelines for you so you don't have to keep track of and memorize each mechanic yourself anymore. Sometimes there's even tools to memorize your rotation for you. The popularity of such tools really does underline how, regardless of whether it is easy or hard to do, it is surprisingly often preferred to outsource the whole memorization aspect to a machine.